Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon for our presentation on managing and reducing the risks of fraud and bribery and corruption. The panel today consists of three of us. I'm going to be chatting to you about some general concepts around fraud and bribery and corruption. I'm also going to be joined by my colleague, Charles Visser, who will speak to you about the Namibian regulatory environment and some of the challenges that have been experienced in Namibia lately regarding fraud and bribery and corruption. And then we have Jimmy, who is a practitioner with international expertise in investigating fraud, bribery and corruption, as well as implementing compliance programs to assist companies to proactively manage their fraud and bribery and corruption risks. And then at the end of our presentation, we'll also have some questions. We'll have an opportunity for you to ask us some questions. So please pop your questions in the question and answer box, and then we'll address those directly at the end of the webinar. I'm going to start presenting our presentation and take you through some of the issues that we will be chatting about today. So I'll deal with welcome and introduction, the general concepts of fraud and corruption, and why people commit fraud and bribery. And then Charles will take you through the regulation of anti-bribery and corruption in Namibia, the spotlight on fraud and corruption in Namibia, and then Jimmy will take you, as I mentioned, through the compliance program and what constitutes an effective compliance program. So the association, there's a significant overlap in the concepts of fraud and bribery and corruption. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners defines the act of fraud as an activity that relies on deception in order to achieve a gain. Now, the ACFE is a professional organization, an international organization consisting of fraud examiners, people who conduct investigations and advise on the conducting of investigations and the implementation of compliance programs across the world. So how do they describe fraud? An activity that relies on deception in order to achieve a gain. Very similarly, for example, in South Africa, fraud is defined as the willful making of a misrepresentation in order to achieve a monetary benefit, right? So regarding organizational fraud, the ACFE broadly categorizes fraud into two categories: internal fraud or occupational fraud. This generally involves an employee being involved in the commission of the fraud, and external fraud, which self-evidently would then involve third parties like vendors or customers perpetrating the fraud against the company. From a business perspective, the ACFE definition of corruption is on point. It defines corruption as a scheme in which an employee misuses their influence in a business transaction in a way that violates their duty to the employer in order to gain a direct or indirect benefit. The ACFE further includes the activity of corruption under occupational fraud, and it will become clear why when you look at the similarities and the overlap between the two concepts, and it's illustrated by the following examples. So when you think of both occupational fraud and bribery and corruption involve almost the same activities, but with different intention and potentially slightly different participants. So, for example, when you think of asset misappropriation, you can have an employee that's involved in asset misappropriation through the issuing of fictitious or inflated invoices where they collude with the service provider to submit those invoices to the business so that those invoices are paid. Both the service provider and the employee would benefit from the fraud being perpetrated against the company. Similarly, in a scenario where there's bribery, you would also potentially have a fictitious or inflated invoice that a third-party service provider or vendor would generate, and the funds that flowed from that would be used to remunerate the employee in return for them having used their influence to for example, award a contract to that supplier. Similarly, asset misappropriation, when employee misrepresents to management the credentials of a service provider so that they can award a contract to that service provider. Similarly, in a corruption environment, employee might hide their interest in a contract or misrepresent their relationship with a specific service provider or not disclose their conflict of interest in respect of that service provider so that that service provider will be appointed to conduct the work on behalf of the company. So very similar concepts, very close association between the two, and depending on the facts, it could be classified one way or the other. So one other point to bear in mind is that corruption may be further categorized into public and private bribery. Private or commercial corruption involves private entities. And in South Africa, for example, that kind of conduct is criminalized now in our Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. And similarly, the corruption that receives a lot of focus or a lot of attention worldwide is public bribery. That involves a public official or a government official. Well, usually a public official is a government official, although the definition goes a little bit more widely. And that receives a lot of focus, for example, in both Namibia and in South Africa. So why do people commit fraud or bribery? A very common understanding or very common way to understand the factors that influence people to commit fraud and bribery and corruption can be explained through the fraud triangle. One, opportunity. Second, the incentive or pressure, and third, rationalization. Opportunity is the one area where an employer can influence an employee's ability to commit fraud or bribery and corruption in their environment. Because opportunity speaks to having an environment that is conducive to committing fraud or corruption. Either there's poor tone in the organization in that there's not a strong internal commitment in the organization to conducting business ethically, or there could be poor controls in the organization or poor oversight, employees having too much influence in the organization, not having proper segregation of duties. So this is one aspect of the fraud triangle where companies can influence an employee's ability to commit fraud, bribery, and or corruption by putting in place the proper systems, and Jimmy will speak to that a little bit later on, what constitutes an effective compliance program. Incentive and pressure, those are the common incentives that you would be thinking about. People experiencing either pressure, financial pressure. They have a gambling addiction, financial distress, which many people find themselves in as a result of current economic conditions in most countries, as well as having potential internal pressures in an organization to meet your targets, to be seen as successful, to keep your employment, and then rationalization. An employee finding ways to rationalize their conduct because there is a very the culture in the organization is conducive to committing corruption or appears to be accepting of that kind of behavior or any kind of rationalization that the employee can use to justify their behavior by relabeling their behavior to remove the moral stigma. Similarly, when people commit bribery, it's spurred on by the same kind of environment or same kind of factors. So opportunities would speak to weak controls and poor oversight, poor culture of ethics, no governance, a highly regulated environment, perceived lack of enforcement, and no accountability. Similarly, with incentives or pressure, there's demands from a third party, anticipated benefit of paying the bribe, so a financial incentive, and then financial benefits of receiving the bribe. And then rationalization, the perception that bribery is widespread, everybody's doing it, it's okay. The employee is entitled to this because they're not properly appreciated by the company. The act is performed for the benefit of the organization and not for the individual. Entitlement or poor salaries, seeing a bribe as a supplement to their income. So those are the general concepts that are relevant in discussions about fraud and bribery and corruption. We now move on to, and I'm going to hand over to Charles, who will move on to an overview of the pertinent anti-fraud and corruption legislation in Namibia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, thank you, Swat. Namibia and the legislative framework in Namibia, compared to our neighbor in South Africa, is not as advanced and well developed. The reasons for that are myriad, and will take up a certain amount of time and a lot of amount of time to debate and get to the bottom of. Be that as it may, we need to deal with, from a Namibian context, with what we have. And first and foremost, if we start with the concept of fraud, fraud is a common law crime, effectively being defined and developed by our common law over many a year through precedents in our courts, academic opinion, and, as I said, judicial interpretation. So it's a common law offense in contrast to a statutory offense. And we'll look at corruption and bribery in a moment, which are statutory offenses. What precisely constitutes fraud in the Namibian context? Well, fraud is defined as the intentional and unlawful making of a misrepresentation, which effectively cause actual or potential prejudice to another. And if we hone in on what a misrepresentation is, we note that a misrepresentation can be an act, a positive action, which will then induce another person to do something or not to do something, or the misrepresentation may well be an omission, not doing something or failing to do something, in this instance, by way of analogy, failing to disclose a conflict of interest. So fraud is a common law offense. It is not regulated by statute, by act, and the principles underpinning fraud have been developed and are applied by our courts and judicial system. If we move on to our anti-bribery and anti-corruption legislation, that is effectively regulated by the Anti-Corruption Act 2 of 2003. If you consider the Anti-Corruption Act, although it deals with various issues, it is not as comprehensive and complete as one would expect. Expect in a developing society like Namibia. It is almost as if the Anti-Corruption Act has stagnated in respect of certain aspects and have not kept trend with developments in the rest of the world. Be that as it may, as said previously, this is our act, this is our statutory legislation in terms of which corruption and bribery is tackled. What is the aim of the Anti-Corruption Act? Well, first and foremost, it is to establish the Anti-Corruption Commission. And that is the statutory body that is tasked effectively to combat and prevent and effectively recommend punishment of corruption. The Anti-Corruption Act effectively creates the offense of bribery, which in essence entails the acceptance or the soliciting of a benefit or gratification in return for to do or not to do something, or for having done or not done something. So there's a gratification concept to our definition of bribery. What is a gratification? What is solicited? Well, a gratification is a wide term, a wide definition, and serious consideration should be given to the intricate provisions of the Act when it deals with gratification. On a broad stroke or a general assessment of gratification, it involves receiving money, gifts, loans, fees, reward of kind, commission, property, whether movable or immovable, position, status, a promise of a service agreement. Those are all gratifications which potentially may form the basis of the act of bribery. Bribery can loosely be categorized in active bribery and passive bribery. Now, active bribery refers to the act of promising or of giving the bribe. So that's the briber, the active briber, as opposed to passive bribery, which refers to the act of receiving a bribe. Bribery can be initiated by either the active briber or the passive briber. It obviously, as can be seen from these two definitions, involves two parties, one giving and one receiving. As Swart referred to a while earlier, private and public bribery is a concept familiar to the Namibian situation. Private bribery referring to officials in the private sector, private sphere of the economy, and public bribery referring to the officials in the public sphere. What is also important is to keep in mind that the Anti-Bribery Act also criminalizes agents and the conduct of agents, specifically where agent would solicit a bribe or tender or offer a bribe whilst acting in the fulfillment or the performance of the affairs or businesses of their principals. The role of the Anti-Corruption Commission, as we said previously, is specifically to investigate, to receive complaints of bribery, corruption, to investigate claims of corruption and bribery, and ultimately, if sufficient proof and support of these allegations are found, to refer those investigations to the prosecuting authority. In a Namibian context would be the Prosecutor General. Generally, and this is one of the weaker aspects of the Anti-Corruption Act, generally whistleblowers and witness protection aspects are not as well defined and developed in the Act. Section 52 of the Act do make provision for the non-disclosure of information and informers during court proceedings. Similarly, references to informers can be redacted by order of court in documentation presented to court, and ultimately or lastly, also informers are safeguarded or protected against proceedings of disciplinary, civil, and criminal proceedings. But that's effectively the extent of whistleblower protection that we find in our Anti-Corruption Act. And as I said, it's an underdeveloped concept. And that was obviously recognized by the government, by the legislator, who during 27 enacted two acts, namely the Whistleblower Protection Act and the Witness Protection Act, respectively Act 10 and Act 11 of 27. Although these two acts, which are tailor-made and specifically geared to protect whistleblowers specifically, and witnesses who ultimately must present evidence and on whose evidence prosecution and conviction of bribery and fraud and corruption ultimately must be premised. despite the fact that these two acts were passed by Parliament, they have not been brought into operation. Since 27, these acts are in existence, but for some other reason, these acts have not been brought into operation and still are not in operation. So when it comes to protection of witnesses and whistleblowers, we're back to Section 52 of the Anti-Corruption Act. And as we've said, those specific provisions have their shortcomings. When it comes to legal entities, corporate legal entities, generally, those entities are governed by the Companies Act, Act 28 of 2004. Namibia has a corporate governance code in place, NAM code, and corporate entities are expected to ascribe to the provisions and guidelines and regulations enacted in these two pieces of in the Act and in the code. It is important to keep in mind that a corporate entity ultimately, along with the individual, is ultimately liable if offences of fraud and corruption are discovered and may be prosecuted in terms of Section 332 of the Criminal Procedure Act. So there are serious consequences and effect of these type of offences and like fraud and bribery being discovered or uncovered in a corporate entity. Namibia is a signature to the UN Convention Against Corruption. That was ratified by the Namibian Parliament on the 27th of April 2004. And Namibia is also a signatory to the African Union Convention of Preventing of Combating Corruption. That was ratified by the Parliament on 5 August 2004. So from that point of view, Namibia is subscribed to and must effectively apply the principles set out in those protocols. Spotlight on fraud and corruption. I think there's without any hesitation and no doubt that both fraud and corruption is prevalent, and cases of these crimes are often reported in and carried in the local press and media. And we've selected a few just to highlight the prevalence of these offences and also the extent of these offences. In this instance, the multi-choice matter is highlighted, where employees defrauded the company of about $2 million Namibian dollars. Again, a private entity, a private company, being the victim of fraud by its own employees. Also from a public sphere perspective, employees at the Department of Education defrauded the department of $9 million. So that's the other side of the spectrum, in the public sector. SEMAS, the Public Service Employee Medical Aid Scheme, again, the victim of service providers, doctors. Doctors practicing in the sphere of private sphere, and SEMAS in the public sphere. Nam Brewery is one of the well-reputed companies in Namibia, the victim of fraud by employees of $6.3 million, and then SAA, $13 million. Again, employees being the cause of that loss. Probably the most renowned and highlighted incident of fraud, corruption, bribery is the fish rod scandal. I think it's well publicized and well carried in the media. The saga has been ongoing since 2019 when it was discovered, and seemingly involves the whole set of offenses: fraud, corruption, bribery. These incidents have no doubt put Namibia in the world view. Transparency International and their corruption index have scored Namibia as late as, or recent as 2021, 49 out of 100. And Namibia has dropped down to the 58th place out of 180 countries in this index. This is lower than the previous assessment that was made in 2018, where Namibia scored 53rd out of 100. This state of affairs has been noticed by the Anti-Corruption Commission, who has expressed their concern, and it obviously requires urgent intervention, not only from the authorities, but also from private sector and the companies. It is corruption and fraud, bribery is systemic, and as Stuart has indicated in her part of the presentation, there are various reasons for it. Ultimately, a concerted effort is required, not only from public sector, but also from private sector to maintain and to eradicate this problem. I will hand over to Jimmy just to conclude the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just following on from Stuart and Charles, I thought I would start with discussing with you what is the cost of fraud and corruption to an organization. Next slide, please, Stuart. Okay, thank you. With fraud, it's very difficult to pinpoint a number, but the number that's been touted over the years is that on average, company or corporation loses approximately 5% of their revenue annually as a result of fraud perpetrated against the organization. And if you want to take a little bit of a look at this, the ACFE 2022 report to the nations asked their various certified fraud examiners to estimate fraud in their organizations, the organizations that they work with, and this magical 5% number seems to be the prevailing thought process around it. On bribery and corruption issues, it's in a sense it's a little easier to calculate known bribe cases because they are very often reported. And the OECD, Organization for Economic Development, in the period 1994 to 2014, conducted a survey of reported cases of bribery that had been either settled or where convictions had been obtained, and try to compile various statistics around the incidence of bribery and corruption. One of the points that they came up with is that the average cost of the bribe to public officials amounted to 10 to 11% of the transaction value. So in a transaction value of $100,000, the average bribe that would be paid would be around $10,000, $10,000 to $11,000 in order to obtain that particular contract for $100,000. These cases, of course, are very, very widely, and as I say, these are reported cases, and they are reported cases related to public officials only, so public or government officials. What the OECD further did is they took a look at, who's paying the biggest bribes, and they came up with the following scenario. So the extractive industries, and by extractive industries I mean mining, oil and gas in particular, on average paid 21% of the total value of the transaction in bribes in order to obtain the transaction. Wholesale and retail on the reported cases, the average value of the bribe was 19% of the transaction value. Transport and storage and manufacturing 16%, and health 14%. What's really interesting though is that on average, the bribe that was paid, so the 10.9% figure mentioned above, constituted approximately 35% of the profits that the transaction generated to the organization. So it's a considerable amount of the actual profits that one generates is being eaten up with the value of the bribe. And of course, let's be frank about this. The bribe value or the bribe request is most often built into the pricing of the transaction. So you're ending up paying 34-35% more of the value of the profit value of the transaction by becoming involved in a bribe scheme. Now, another significant cost of corruption is the increased cross-border enforcement of corruption, and this is particularly of interest and should be of concern to entities that are multinationals or subsidiaries of multinationals. So operations that may have their headquarters in other countries, but their local operations in Namibia, Namibian entities who have operations in other countries. The movement to cross-border enforcement of corruption is growing. It started all off with the Department of Justice in the USA and the promulgation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. And the Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission in the US has been rigorously enforcing corruption cases over the past 25 years. This deals with foreign public officials only. So it's bribes where foreign public officials were involved. And just to give you an idea of the reach of the US legislation, a very good example is that of Siemens. I'll highlight it a little further, but in essence, in 2008, Siemens was caught up in a massive bribery scandal, and its subsidiaries in countries such as Hungary, some countries in Southeast Asia, were found to have made illicit payments to public officials in those countries in order to obtain lucrative government contracts. Now, Siemens is a company that is listed in Germany. Its operations that were involved in the bribery schemes were in foreign countries, as I say, such as Hungary, Southeast Asia, and yet the US was able to pursue a successful enforcement of bribery against Siemens. The premise of Siemens's involvement is that Siemens had extensive business holdings in the US, as do most multinationals, and consequently, the operations in the US were under threat. The Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission have been known to exercise wide-ranging interpretations of the over the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. For instance, it's recently been documented the state capture scandal in South Africa involving the Gupta family. The US has opened investigations under the FCPA there, and there seems to be absolutely no link on the face of it to the Guptas and the US. However, it appears that various of the payments and transactions occurred in the US dollar currency, and the US authorities have drawn a nexus to the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, through the use of the US currency. So it's incredibly wide-ranging and very broadly interpreted in order to develop a nexus in the US. If we go back to the previous slide and we just deal with some of the other countries that are actively enforcing cross-border enforcement, cross-border corruption matters at the moment. The Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom, or as it is now called, Great Britain, has increased enforcement actions of bribery with foreign public officials under the UK Bribery Act. The UK Bribery Act is very interesting as well because it also makes an offence for an entity or individual that has defined connections with Great Britain to be prosecuted and pursued for private bribery. So private bribery, as Charles and sort of explained to you, is bribery between two corporations, for instance, or individuals in various companies, and not public officials and not foreign public officials. So it's extremely broad and extremely wide. Canada, for years, has had statute on its books, the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, but it took the SNC Lavalin matter. Lavalin is an engineering company involved in engineering, design, consultancy, etc. Lavalin is a Canadian-based company, and it was involved in a series of corruption allegations through various of its subsidiaries based in other countries again, and that was really the start of Canada using its act effectively. So Canada has also begun prosecuting organizations and individuals under its Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. What is also very interesting is that Canada has gone after the individuals involved in it. Traditionally, in the US, the SEC and the DOJ have gone after the organizations and realized massive settlements without prosecuting individuals. Canada took a different route. It not only went after the organization, the SNC, the Lavalin organization from the outset, but it went after individuals as well, and it has just recently secured successful prosecutions under the Act. Germany, a lot of people tell you that not so long ago a bribe was not seen as a crime, and in fact a German company could claim tax relief for a bribe paid under certain conditions. It is true to an extent that was the situation. However, with the Siemens matter in particular, enormous pressure appears to have been placed on the German authorities by the US authorities to further prosecute Siemens and individuals in the Siemens corporate structure that were involved in the bribery schemes from 2008. And since then, Germany's Criminal Code and Administrative Offences Act have come to the party, criminalized corruption, and are now starting to hold, and Germany is now starting to hold companies civilly responsible for corruption offences committed on behalf of the company. With the French agencies, are also stepping up enforcement efforts under the 2016 SAPIN 2 law, which again focuses to a large extent on bribery of foreign corrupt officials. Headlines not that long ago, a couple of months ago, is that China has imposed death sentences for violations under their corruption legislation. And the OECD continues to encourage enhancements to anti-bribery legislation and efforts worldwide. Signatories to the OECD are subject to regular reviews by the OECD, who go through the legislation, go through actual prosecutions, and provide well-documented recommendations, criticisms, requests for enhancements in those countries that are signatories to the OECD Convention on the Combating of Bribery and Corruption of Public Officials. Now, the next slide just details a couple of this is the top 10 as at today's date of enforcement actions under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by the Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission in the US. There's some pretty big numbers here. If you think that not so long ago Siemens was number one with a settlement of $800 million for the issues that I've mentioned, the fines are increasing incrementally, with Goldman Sachs, Airbus, Petrobras, Ericsson, and Telia Company all having agreed and paid settlements exceeding $1 billion US. It's a massive amount of money. I've also highlighted the corporate seat of these organizations, so you can also see from that again, these entities are not all US based, and in fact, there has been some criticism that the DOJ and the SEC tend to go after multinationals with corporate seats outside of the US. You can see Airbus, the Netherlands and France, Brazil, Petrobras, Sweden, Ericsson, Telia, Sweden, MTS, Russia, Siemens, Germany, Wimpelcom in the Netherlands, Alstom, France, and the most recent large settlement, that of Glencore, the mining entity, based in Switzerland, $700 million settlement. These are the headlines, and I thought I'd also just like to draw your attention to some of the other law enforcement actions that may be relevant. So this is the top 10, but I just wanted to give you an indication of some of the other recent settlements. So in 2019, Barclays Bank paid over $6 million in order to settle charges regarding the hiring of relatives and friends of foreign government officials. The US authorities came to the conclusion that the hiring of these relatives of foreign government officials had as its purpose the influencing of these persons in connection with its investment banking businesses. In 2019, Deutsche Bank agreed to pay more than $16 million for exactly the same issue, the hiring of relatives of foreign government officials in order to improperly influence them in connection with their investment banking business. In 2019, Fresenius, which is a German manufacturer of medical products specializing in kidney machines, agreed to pay more than $16 million regarding the agreed to pay more than $231 million US dollars for improper payments to foreign government officials in countries including Morocco and Angola. In 2018, Kinross agreed a penalty of $950,000 US for inter alia having awarded a lucrative logistics contract to a company preferred by Mauritanian government officials. Kinross was also found to have contracted a politically connected consultant in order to facilitate contacts with high-level Mauritanian government officials without having performed any heightened due diligence on the individual. 2017, Halliburton agreed to pay more than $29 million after agreeing to engage an Angolan company on the advice of officials of Angola's state oil company. This local company was paid 3.7 million for its services, and in turn, Halliburton were awarded 7 lucrative subcontracts. Getting back to what I'd said earlier, Halliburton made a profit of $14 million from the deals, paid a bribe, or effectively paid the local company 3.7 million, but ended up having to pay 29.2 million in the settlement to the DOJ, which is a net loss of over $12 million. 2016, Brazilian company Embraer, manufacturer of aircraft, agreed to pay more than 205 million in settlement, $205 million settlement again to the US Treasury, after inter alia having made an alleged $800,000 bribe payment through a third-party agent to foreign government officials in Mozambique in order to secure a government contract for the delivery of aircraft in Mozambique. 2015, and the list goes on. I'm just giving you some of the examples that are closer to home. In 2015, the Japanese corporation Hitachi agreed to pay $19 million to settle Securities Exchange Commission charges regarding the improper dividends of $5 million paid to a company related to the African National Congress in South Africa. It was reflected as dividends to the ANC-controlled vehicle, Chancellor House, and the SE deemed that these payments were made in order to obtain political influence that led to the conclusion of various contracts with Eskom in favor of Hitachi being a Japanese company. And in 2015, Billiton, BHP Billiton, the mining group, invited and paid for the hospitality of 60 government officials, primarily from Africa and Asia, to attend the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. They paid various sums ranging, as I recall, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 US dollars for the hosting. So 4-day, 5-day, first-class flights, hotel accommodation, and attendance of the Beijing Olympics. And again, the SEC and the DOJ, when they scrutinize the rationale behind the invitations and the payments, most of these invitees were to government officials that were connected to pending contract negotiations or regulatory dealings, in other words, to obtain licenses and permits, access rights to mining activities. So that's just a flavor of how far the FCPA is extended, and as I've said, other foreign jurisdictional legislation is moving in the same way. So, what can we do about it? Obviously, the first step would be to outlaw all bribes or payments of bribes within an organization. But it's a far more complex issue than that. Next slide, please, Sword. So I think what's very important for everyone to understand is that a compliance program is needed within your organization in order to stop fraud and theft. You've heard the figures of the fraud cases. Recent fraud cases in Namibia, they're large sums, and what exacerbates fraud in particular is that it takes so long for the frauds to actually be uncovered. With the multi-choice matter, the frauds and it's really simple fraud. Falsified invoices for marketing expenses. The frauds were perpetrated between the period 2010 and August 2013. So the fraud ran 3.5 years before it was detected, and that's why you have a value of around 2 million Namibian dollars that could have been perpetrated by the employee within the organization. It takes a long time to uncover fraud. So an anti-fraud and anti-bribery compliance program is something that one needs to consider if you want to reduce the 5% that you are paying to fraud, and as much as the 34% of profits that you lose in a bribery scheme. So one of the most important things around an effective compliance program is that it's got to be underpinned by proportionality. So the policies and procedures that an organization enact should be proportionate to the risks faced by the organization and the nature, scale, and complexity of the organization's activities and operations. If we step back to Siemens for a minute, so Siemens at the time of the alleged bribe payments, which preceded 2008, had a very small compliance organization. Post the settlement, and that settlement, ladies and gentlemen, was not only the $800 million that was paid to the US Treasury, but the German authorities fined Siemens a further 600 million, and the DOJ compelled Siemens to do self-investigation and self-reporting, and they had to hire hundreds of lawyers and forensic accountants, and it's reputed that the fees for the investigation were pretty much in line with the fines. So it cost Siemens a lot of money. Consequently, Siemens engaged a compliance unit, which at one stage totaled around 700 individuals, all involved in compliance, which is a massive upscale of the original compliance program. Now, obviously, an organization like Siemens is very different to a small mining house that generates 40 or 50 million US dollars in profit annually, and again, the proportionality around it includes, what are we going to do? Are we going to install a Rolls-Royce at huge cost in order to deal with compliance within the organization, or are we going to look at specific issues and tailor our compliance program to the risks that we face and the propensity for those risks? Now, I think it must be clear to everyone that the big risks involve public entities. So where fraud, where corruption has a government official involved in the matter, or employees of state-owned enterprise, the risk level escalates significantly. But where an organization is not dealing with public officials in any manner, then that risk is of low risk, and the internal procedures within an organization should take cognizance of that fact, and not focus on public bribery, for instance, if you're not doing business with government. So the compliance program needs to be tailored, and I think this is very much in line with the Namibian Code, Corporate Governance Code. I know that the NAM Code is not is not compulsory. There's no legislation that underpins the NAM code at this stage in Namibia. But the Namibian code is based upon the King Code, the South African King Code, King 3 in fact. King 3 has been updated in South Africa to the King 4 Code, but deals with a whole lot of good business practices, and I think is an indispensable guide to corporate governance in Namibia. So the code deals with and gives guidance on ethical leadership and corporate citizenship. The first point here on the slide, top-level commitment, tone from the middle. It deals with the need to apply appropriate measures and compliance programs, and oversee and ensure that the compliance programs function. And again, if one comes back to an effective compliance program, it pretty much touches everything that you see on this particular slide. So, in short, an effective compliance program should deal with the following. It should show top-level commitment and tone from the middle. So it's important that not only the board of the organization puts out a message that fraud, bribery, and corruption are not acceptable within the organization, and that they as a board are committed to doing away with it. But it's also important that this is carried through to middle management as well. It's one thing having the board say one thing, but practice at middle and lower management being something very different. Top-level commitment includes communication and display of that ethical leadership. And again, you'll find this in the corporate governance code for Namibia. One would expect clear messaging on the ethics and the culture of the organization. That's usually done through issue and distribution of a code of ethics or a code of conduct. A demonstrable top-level commitment by the government governing body of the organization. So, you know, if the financial director is involved in illicit practices and is not hauled before a disciplinary committee and dismissed as other employees would be in terms of an internal disciplinary policy, then the governing body of the organization is not demonstrating that top-level commitment to zero tolerance for fraud and corruption within the organization. It's the old saying, you know, walk the talk. And again, reiterating tone from the middle as well. It's very important that commitment and that ethical leadership is also displayed by middle and lower management within the organization. Top-level commitment also requires effective and ongoing communication with employees, including training on the code of ethics within the organization. And top-level commitment is often embodied by promotion of a confidential reporting mechanism, which focuses on a no retaliation policy. You heard from Charles, there is legislation on the books in Namibia which hasn't been implemented as such yet on whistleblowers and protection of whistleblowers. But there's nothing that stops you from within the organization of implementing a hotline and a confidential reporting mechanism that people can report to, and where it's demonstrably clear to individuals that their reports will be treated with confidentiality and under some circumstances with anonymity as well. An effective compliance program starts off with a risk assessment. That's the beginning process in order to pull your whole compliance program together. And with a risk assessment, what you need to do is sit down and evaluate your internal risks and external risks. We're dealing here particularly with fraud and bribery and corruption. So it would be a case of looking at internal fraud and possible external fraud. Where do your issues lie? How do we deal with that? I'll speak on the risk identification process shortly. Once you've identified your risks, you would set up your risks in a risk register, and then you would have a look at it and assess those risks for probability and impact. So what is the likelihood or probability of the risk occurring within the organization, and what would the impact on the organization be if the fraud took place or corruption occurred? Impact, again, to be determined on issues such as reputational impact, financial impact to the organization. Once you've taken those risks and assessed them for probability and impact, you would then evaluate them against the internal controls of your organization in order to determine whether the controls you have in place currently are effective or need to be enhanced. Where controls are not in place that would assist in mitigating the risk of that particular illicit act occurring within the organization, then those controls need to be implemented. You may have controls in place that are not effective and serve very little function within the organization, and you would need to look at new controls or enhanced controls and discard those ineffective controls within the organization. There are 2 points that I really want to make here regarding risk of bribery and corruption. It's imperative within an organization to understand the risks of bribery and corruption that your business partners pose to the organization. And by business partners, we talk of suppliers, agents, distributors, consultants, third-party intermediaries. Just to note, a third-party intermediary is the common term of the use of an individual, an agent, a consultant who mediates on your behalf, particularly with government. These could be you may outsource your customs business, your export and import business. You may engage customs agents, and you may give them the mandate to engage the authorities on your behalf, tax consultants, etc. That's what we mean by third-party intermediaries. Customers, it's also important to understand who you're selling to, and particularly in today's environment, as we see more and more emphasis placed on the other elements, sustainability elements in particular, slave labor, the blood diamonds issue. So procuring raw materials from conflict countries, the so-called conflict minerals, understanding those sort of issues with your customers in the long run as well, and your joint venture partners. So entities that you're going into a JV with from a business purpose. And you may be coming in as the senior partner, or you may be coming in as a junior partner to the joint venture. You need to look at the risks and the ability to control those risks when entering a joint ventureship. For instance, an example of the type of joint venture is where 2 mining houses operate a mine in a foreign jurisdiction that is high risk, and the ownership interest may be 50%, but the management control is held by one of the joint venture partners. It's very important for the other partner to understand and the controls in place, and to understand whether the risks of bribery and corruption are being effectively mitigated by the JV partner. It's also really important to understand who your JV partner is and what his links are. Are there links to government officials that might place you in an embarrassing situation should it come to light? Regulators therefore require that organizations perform risk-based due diligence procedure over their third parties, which includes ongoing monitoring, particularly of those third parties that are deemed to pose a high risk of corruption. Third-party due diligence is not part of today's discussion. We will touch on it at a later date. There's various articles that will be going out shortly. So if you are interested in it, please advise, and we'll ensure that you also receive copies of those articles. So how do we actually identify potential risks in the organization? Best practice includes posing and answering the following questions in respect to potential risks. The compliance framework. Does the organization's legal and regulatory compliance framework create risks for it? And again, here's an example of that. You have activities in neighboring countries. You have a shareholding. Sorry, not a, you have shares or deposits in the US. Does that mean that you not only have to adhere to Namibian legislation and be compliant with the regulations in Namibia, but do you also have to know and understand and comply with the legal and regulatory framework of the UK? Do you fall foul of the UK Bribery Act? Same with the US. Do you fall foul of the US FCPA through your shareholding or through your deposits that you trade in the US, or through a secondary listing that you may have in one of these countries, in the US, in Germany, in the UK, in South Africa, in Australia? Those are all issues that you need to understand, and understand what is required and what issues may lurk for you. Do you understand the concept of fraud in Australia, for instance, if you're doing business in Australia, or do you understand the regulations that govern the issue of licenses in financial services in Zimbabwe? Country risk, the next question to pose, and it's very simple. Do we operate in an environment in which fraud or corruption is committed with impunity? Are we operating across borders or in foreign jurisdictions that are regarded as high risk? And there are various issues. There's various guides in this respect. Charles mentioned a little earlier Transparency International issues the CPI, Corruption Perceptions Index, on an annual basis, which is a survey conducted in country in each of the countries by entities or NGOs within those countries, dealing with issues such as impunity and public bribery, public corruption. Do we operate across borders or in foreign jurisdictions that are regarded as high risk? Are we acquiring our base minerals or various of our supplies from conflict-ridden countries, from countries that have sanctions imposed against them? these are all sort of issues that one needs to discuss and to consider when you're looking at the country risk of your operation. Sectoral risk. Do the activities and operations that we undertake expose the organization to increased risk? It's clear that certain industries have a higher risk when it comes to fraud and corruption. The financial services industry, for instance, it's a highly regulated industry. There's money, so there's a clear incentive for defrauding the organization. It needs licenses to operate in various countries. So there's interaction with government officials. Similarly, pharmaceuticals, medical health devices, mining and exploration, logistics and transport across borders. These are all issues, all sectors or industries that have high risk or increased risk because of the nature of their business. They're required to, for instance, a logistics company that does cross-border transporting has to deal with customs officials all the time, and the risk of having to pay bribes to customs officials in order to get the goods released or to move the goods through the borders in order to deliver the goods in a timely manner to its clients. Operational transactional risk. Again, are there certain of our operations within our organization which depend on processes that are generally recognized as being vulnerable to fraud or corruption? Procurement, significant procurement, where you're acquiring the majority of your raw materials and you're manufacturing from the raw materials that your supplier or vendor list runs literally into thousands of entities. Procurement is obviously high risk for fraud, for being defrauded. Payroll, another example where you have a significant amount of people on your payroll. Is there a risk that you have employees on the payroll that are ghost employees? And by the very nature of your business, that you employ a large amount of people, it goes unnoticed. And again, 5%, 10% of your payroll is in fact being paid to ghost employees. So those are the ways that you would go, the process that you would go through in order to identify the risks to the organization. Business partners, looking at your business partners, do any of your business partnerships increase the risk of fraud or corruption? And business opportunities. Again, for instance, you decide to participate as a member of a consortium in a significant public works exercise, construction of roads, construction of bridges, and you're appointed as the main contractor, but you need to appoint a host of subcontractors in order to actually deliver. And is there a risk that certain of your subcontractors are in fact fronts for government officials who won't be delivering very much, and that the payments that are channeled as part of the transaction to those subcontractors are in fact the underpinning bribes which led to the award of the contract. So these are all sorts of issues that one would take when you're identifying a risk. Next slide, please, Stuart. As I said, once you've identified key risks, those risks need to be documented into a risk register, and they need to be evaluated and prioritized. You may start off with 300 odd risks, and once you've gone through the process of looking at the likelihood, probability, and impact of it, of those risks, your starting point would be to focus attention on those business activities and relationships which are the most risky to the organization, and then go to your controls environment, your systems and controls environment, and see whether you've got adequate protection of mitigation. Let's not fool anybody. Fraud and bribery have been around since the beginning of time and are not going to disappear. But the trick is to mitigate it. So in other words, reduce as much as possible the ability of persons to defraud the organization, reduce the probability of anyone within the organization participating in a bribery and corruption scheme. And take those high risks, those key risks that you've identified, and go to the control environment and test whether your controls are actually appropriate and adequate and are doing what they're supposed to do, mitigate those key risks. And then to establish whether additional controls need to be designed and implemented in order to mitigate your key risks. That's the one side of things. So the starting point is your risk assessment. The next side is to look at an anti-fraud or ABAC policy for the organization. And the fraud and ABAC policy is something that you would issue to your staff. It would be something that that management, so whether it's board level or junior management, and staff, whether it's the most senior staff member or the most junior staff member, subscribe to. And so your fraud and ABAC policy needs to be clear, it needs to be simple, and it needs to be understood by the target audience. What is a best practice fraud and ABAC policy generally look like? Well, the first thing is the starting point, the statement of active commitment by management to ethical conduct, that tone at the top that you're trying to convey to the employee. Secondly, a zero tolerance policy for fraud and corruption. There's no exception when it comes to these sort of issues, and that and it should be made clear that it's not tolerated within the organization, and it will be dealt with as strictly as your disciplinary processes can deal with it. It may require a relook at your disciplinary procedures, and a reworking of issues or contraventions of the disciplinary procedure that allow you to terminate, immediate termination, for instance. So it must be clear right from the outset that the organization doesn't tolerate fraud and corruption. As I said, it's adherence without exception by management and employees. A lot of companies are also issuing these types of policies and subjecting their business partners to the policy, or certainly to portions thereof. So you very often see now that that in the contractual process, the vendor or supplier undertakes to adhere to the anti-fraud or ABAC policy of the engaging organization, and you may in fact even see the policy as part of the contract, as an annexure to the contract. The issue is, again, are your business partners, do your business partners have similar provisions? Is there any driving reason for you to require your business partner to actually adhere to your policy. That is part of your evaluation of your new prospective and existing business partners. The importance within the importance of consequences cannot be overestimated. It's really important that in your policy you make it clear what the consequences of non-adherence to the policy will be. That goes for management and employees that fail to adhere to the organization's policy. But the gravity of the impact of an illegal act must also be stressed in the policy. So you need to tell your employees that if you bribe a government official and it comes out, the organization is going to be in a lot of trouble. The Anti-Corruption Commission will launch an investigation. You're going to be in the newspapers. Your reputation is going to be shot. If it's cross-border, or if you happen to fall foul of the FCPA or Sapiens or the UK Bribery Act, the consequences of bribing a public official are enormous and far-reaching for the organization. Foreign legislation, foreign regulators, enforcement agencies, it's a scary thought. And of course, this is all exacerbated by possible punitive measures. If the transaction that you're involved in involves World Bank funding, there's a possibility that the organization is debarred. Entities such as Siemens, etc., were debarred by the World Bank for a period of time, up to 10 years, from being involved in any form or sort in projects that have been funded by the World Bank. So debarment, blacklisting, and international sanctions measures are massive punitive measures that also need to be considered, and you need to get that across. If that's a risk that you face and it's a risk that you need to address in your policy, you need to get that across to your employees that one wrong step can cause all of these issues for you. Also, it's really important that the policy clearly articulates the sanctions and the measures that would be brought against business partners that fail to adhere to the policy. And more often you're finding that these measures are in fact embodied in the contractual process as well. So it's very clearly spelled out in contracts that if the third party, the business partner, engages in fraudulent activity against the organization, or is involved in a corrupt scheme whereby its employees have bribed your buying department, that the contracts will be cancelled, or will be subject to cancellation clauses and penalty clauses for any payments that may have already been effected against the contract. These are becoming more and more clear, and the policy should articulate some of these issues as well, so that everybody's clear what happens if they engage in illegal action. It's important for the people in your organization to actually understand what fraud and bribery and corruption is, and there's no point in cut and pasting the legislation. You need to put it into layman terms so that everybody in the organization actually understands what fraud is, what bribery and corruption is, and it's good practice to pepper your policy with examples as well, actual examples that are pertinent to your organization. A set of examples in the organization. For instance, entertainment. It's not appropriate for you to take out a public official for lunch and expend X amount on the person. in circumstances where that particular public official is involved in the adjudication of a contract that the organization is currently involved in a tendering process with. Things like that it's really important to get the message across. It's also important that your ABAC policy, your anti-fraud and ABAC policy, also summarizes pertinent issues from other policies. So you may feel that it's necessary, for instance, to have a little section on entertainment, gifts and hospitality, donations, sponsorships, and community investment programs, conflict of interest, and some areas possibly of procurement policy and procedures, or at least as a minimum to include those policies as references to the ABAC and fraud policy, and point the employees in the direction of those policies for further clarification of those issues. As we said, it's good practice. The NAMCO, King 3, King 4, and the draft or the acts that haven't been promulgated yet articulate mechanisms for reporting allegations of fraud and corruption. And I think it's important that whatever process you follow within your organization, it's within this policy, you need to encourage the reporting of suspicions of corrupt activities, and then clearly state that that anybody who comes forward with a report will not be retaliated against, provided that the report is made in good faith, and that you as an organization will do everything in your power to protect the confidentiality of the whistleblower. So that's within an internal reporting line. So you may have a mechanism that says that all reports get made to the head of legal, or head of compliance, or head of internal audit, whatever mechanism you follow. You may opt for the use of an external hotline, or a hotline run by external parties that fields calls, email messages, etc., and then summarizes those issues for you and provides you with summations of key issues on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, whatever you choose, and that the confidentiality of the whistleblower is then protected through the use of the third party. The third party provider of a hotline service. Important that training occurs on a regular basis as part of this whole communication issue. Training should be localized, cross-functional, so get everybody involved and get legal, human resources and the relevant business units involved in the design of the training. The training needs to give practical advice, practical guidance to the target audience. It should be part of the onboarding process for new employees. All new employees should go through training on the anti-fraud and ABAC policy. And there's more and more argument that the policy should be considered in regular employee evaluation processes. So, for instance, where the same old faces don't attend the training sessions, that needs to go into their assessment processes, their interview assessment processes, where employees have embraced the training requirements, are regular attendees, or have attended all compulsory training sessions. That should be a positive for employees in their annual assessment. Make it part of the assessment process. I haven't given much time for questions. My apologies. But thank you very much for joining me and for joining Suad and Charles.
Thanks, Jimmy. We'll have a look at all of the questions that have been put in the question and answer box, and then we'll provide you with answers in writing to the extent that we're able to. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the box and we'll respond to the questions there. Our session will conclude shortly.